All right, so this is my third from reflection. Yeah. Um, and we've kind of been discussing where we want to go from Man for Himself because we were kind of working through that intensively. And so I started flipping through The Art of Loving, also by Erich Fromm, and the section Self Love really caught my attention. And it's from page 54 to 59. Um, and it was interesting because we talked a lot about selfishness in Man for Himself. And it was interesting because, uh, everyone thinks selfishness is such a bad thing and that we have to give ourselves to the greater good. And that means sacrificing what we want as individuals to, help the whole. It's kind of been an idea that's been thrown around, I think, for far too long. But this section, self love, also kind of ties into that, I think, because I think self love is another thing that society kind of frowns upon. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people compare self love to selfishness and that the two kind of are attached. And Fromm brings this up and he says, um, the question arise, these questions arise. Does psychological observation support the thesis that there is a basic contradiction between love for oneself and love for others? Is love for oneself the same phenomenon as selfishness, or are they opposites? Furthermore, is the selfishness of modern man really a concern for himself as an individual, with all his intellectual, emotional, and sensual potentialities? Has he not become an appendage of his socio-economic role? Is his selfishness identical with self-love, or is it not caused by the very lack of it? And I think that this is interesting. At least the last part, which is his selfishness identical with self-love, or is it not caused by the very lack of it? And I think this is interesting because we've talked about in Fromm how to be able to love someone productively in the being mode, we have to first love ourselves. So, um, and I think that's where we get a lot of our kind of empty relationships, or this idea that, I'm falling in love. Once you get to a point where you feel like there's nothing left to discover, there's no other surprises that that person has, it just kind of, you hit rock bottom and then you get out. Um, and I think this is interesting because maybe relationships would work a little bit more if we had love for ourselves first. But I think that's kind of another issue. But Fromm talks about in the Bible, there's the line that says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," and Fromm says, which implies that respect for one's own integrity and uniqueness, love for and understanding of one's own self, cannot be separated from respect and love and understanding for another individual. The love for my own self is inseparably connected with the love for any other being. Um, I think this is interesting because love in principle is, as Fromm says, love in principle is indivisible as far as the connection between object and one's own self is concerned. Genuine love is an expression of productiveness and implies care, respect, responsibility, and knowledge. I think we really hit on that in the section that we kind of looked at, talking about love in Man for Himself. But I totally took a sidetrack. But back to this kind of idea that how selfishness is, like, we connect it to self-love, and also how Fromm mentions, could selfishness be a product of a lack of self-love? I mean, it's interesting because Fromm talks about intensively on page 56 how people who are selfish, they look how they can gain anything from other people, other situations, and that's what they do. They're out for total gain for themselves. And he says, the selfish person does not love himself too much, but too little. In fact, he hates himself. So we talk about how selfishness is bad, and when we say selfishness, we're talking about selfish people are people who hate themselves because they're looking for something to better themselves without looking within. So I think that society actually kind of could potentially breed selfish people because we kind of have this idea that we really shouldn't look inside ourselves, that we should, you know, look to the outside to better everyone else, when actually to make ourselves happy, to live productive lives, we need to look to the inside, which means bettering ourselves. And if we love ourselves, therefore selfishness kind of goes away. So I think society and kind of the ideas that we have in society feed into some of the problems that we have with people being selfish. Um, so I think it's interesting how Fromm really talks about it in here and really talks about connects the issue of selfishness with self-love, which I really didn't think about beforehand, but I think it's interesting that because we don't love ourselves, we tend to be a little bit selfish, or we can be selfish as individuals because we're looking for stuff outside of ourselves to make ourselves happy. So I think it's an interesting idea, and yeah, that's my takeaways from the section self-love. Thanks.